Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I want to take you on a journey to one of the most breathtaking yet contested regions of the world, the Himalayas. When people think of the Himalayas, they often imagine snow-covered peaks, ancient monasteries, or daring climbers scaling Mount Everest. But beneath this natural beauty, something else is happening. Something that could shape the future of Asia's stability. High in these rugged mountains, projects are unfolding at a remarkable speed. Roads are being carved through cliffs, airports are being built at altitudes where oxygen runs thin, and railways are connecting places that once seemed unreachable. On the surface, all of this may look like development, new infrastructure, new energy projects, and modernization. Yet, when you step back and look at the bigger picture, these changes are about much more than just bridges and highways. They are about power, security, and influence. The central focus of today's story is how China is transforming this border region, and why that matters for its complex relationship with India. You see, the border between these two countries is not a neatly drawn line on a map. Instead, it is something known as the line of actual control, a boundary defined less by treaties and more by presence, by where patrols march, where outposts stand, and where infrastructure reaches. That means every new road or airstrip carries meaning. It is not only about convenience, it is about sending a message. And the message is clear: whoever builds faster, moves faster, and responds faster gains the upper hand. In places like Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh, or Akai Chin, infrastructure is more than concrete and steel. It is a demonstration of capability. For China, investing in roads and airports here is like saying, we can be ready no matter how difficult the terrain. For India, watching these developments raises urgent questions. Are these simply defensive measures, or are they signals of deeper intentions? But this is not only a military story. It is also about rivers that flow from the Tibetan Plateau into South Asia. These rivers feed millions of people in India and Bangladesh, supporting crops, fisheries, and entire regional economies. When dams are built upstream, they do not just generate electricity. They also give the upstream country leverage over those who depend on the water downstream. And when the dams in question are among the largest ever built in human history, the consequences could ripple far beyond one nation's borders. So in this video, we will explore three layers of this issue: the roads, rails, and runways that reshape the mountains, the dams and power plants that reshape the rivers, and the geopolitical strategies that tie all of these projects together. Along the way, we will also discuss why this buildup is happening now, how India might respond, and what it means for peace in Asia. By the end, you will see how a region many people think of as remote is actually at the center of a global story, one that blends geography, technology, and politics. So let us dive into the Himalayas, where natural beauty meets strategic ambition, and discover how China is preparing for a potential clash of interests with India. Now that we have set the stage, let us look closer at the transformation itself, because what is happening in the Himalayas is not just about a few isolated projects. It is a sweeping effort to redraw how the region functions, both for local communities and for national defense. Take the highways, for example. For centuries, the Himalayan passes were among the most difficult routes on Earth. Merchants, monks, and even armies had to spend weeks navigating narrow trails, braving avalanches, and relying on pack animals. Today, much of that is changing. China has widened and reinforced the G219, G315, and G318 highways. These roads do not just make travel easier, they drastically reduce the time it takes to move heavy equipment, supplies, and even military vehicles across rugged terrain. What once might have taken weeks can now be done in a matter of days. From a purely civilian perspective, this looks like progress. Local towns gain better access to markets, healthcare, and goods. But from a strategic perspective, these highways are lifelines for mobilization. When analysts describe them as military corridors, they are not exaggerating. Every reinforced bridge and every tunnel carved into rock makes it easier for troops to move quickly toward the border if tensions rise. Airports tell a similar story. At places like Shigatse, new facilities have turned what once looked like a modest civilian airport into something much more versatile. Longer runways now handle fighter jets. Hangars store drones. Surface-to-air missile systems stand nearby. Helicopter landing pads allow for rapid deployment even in valleys where fixed-wing aircraft cannot safely land. These upgrades mean that aircraft can operate effectively in high-altitude conditions that would otherwise be too challenging. And it is not just one airport. Similar projects are happening across Tibet and Xinjiang, many within striking distance of disputed border regions. What is striking is the scale. At least 24 airports along the Himalayas now serve dual purposes. They welcome civilian passengers on some days, and on others, they quietly prepare for the possibility of military operations. The placement of these airports is not random. They are positioned with an eye toward contested areas, like Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh, where India and China have already experienced skirmishes in recent years. And then there is the rail network. China is working on the Sichuan-Tibet line, which will connect Chengdu to Lhasa in under 13 hours. Think about what that means. Troops, ammunition, and supplies traveling over 600 kilometers of harsh terrain in less than a day. Beyond that, the line will branch out toward smaller tracks, inching closer to the Indian border. This is more than a convenience for locals. It is a logistics backbone that can shift the balance in any future standoff. To put it simply, roads, rails, and runways are changing the game. These are not projects built for tourists or casual travelers. They are carefully designed to make movement easier, faster, and more reliable, where it once seemed impossible. And that raises the key question: if all of this is being built in the world's most contested mountain range, is it really just development? Or is it preparation? If highways and airports reshape how people and armies move across the mountains, rivers reshape how entire nations survive. And in the Himalayas, water is not just a resource. It is a lifeline. From the snowcaps of Tibet flow some of the world's most important rivers, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, and the Salween. These rivers feed farmlands, sustain fisheries, and provide drinking water to hundreds of millions of people downstream in India, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia. Whoever controls their flow, in many ways, holds enormous influence over the stability of entire regions. China understands this, and that is why its hydropower ambitions in Tibet have grown to staggering proportions. Perhaps the most ambitious project of all is the Medog Dam on the Yarlung-Tsangpo River. With a projected output of 60 gigawatts, it could become the largest dam in human history, producing 3 times the electricity of the famous Three Gorges Dam. To put that into perspective, this single project could supply power to nearly 300 million homes. For Beijing, the benefits are obvious. A country with rising energy demand, driven by urbanization, industry, and the digital age, needs reliable electricity. And few sources are as clean or as constant as hydro. Moreover, dams in Tibet can power data centers, AI infrastructure, and industries that demand a steady supply of energy. In a world where even artificial intelligence has become a new frontier of competition, energy is as strategic as oil once was. But from the perspective of India and Bangladesh, the stakes look very different. If upstream dams can regulate how much water flows into their fields and cities, that creates a deep vulnerability. During monsoon season, a sudden release of water could trigger floods. During dry months, holding back water could mean drought and crop failures. Even if China never intends to use dams as political leverage, the possibility alone changes the calculation. It creates a sense of dependence, even anxiety among downstream nations. This concern is not just hypothetical. In the 1990s, China built a series of dams on the Mekong River in Yunnan province. Over time, downstream nations like Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar reported serious changes in water flow. Farmers noticed smaller harvests, fish populations declined, and local economies suffered. The experience taught these countries that dams are not simply engineering projects, they are geopolitical instruments. India and Bangladesh worry the same could happen with the Brahmaputra. Another layer is geography. One of the largest planned dams sits near Arunachal Pradesh, a region claimed by both India and China. Building infrastructure there is not just about power generation. It is also a way of reinforcing territorial claims. Each construction site becomes both a symbol and a foothold. So while dams promise electricity, progress, and prestige for China, they simultaneously raise alarm for India and its neighbors. It is this duality development for one side, potential vulnerability for the other, that makes hydropower such a powerful tool of strategy. And as we will see next, these projects are not happening in isolation. They are part of a broader approach where geography, energy, and politics come together in a carefully calculated plan. By now it is clear that the roads, runways, and dams in the Himalayas are not isolated projects. They fit into a larger pattern, a grand design that mixes security, energy, and geopolitics. To understand why China is investing so heavily in this region, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. At its core, China's strategy in the Himalayas is about deterrence and readiness. The terrain is harsh, the climate unforgiving, and moving troops across the mountains is a logistical nightmare. In the past, these obstacles meant that border clashes could be contained simply by geography, but now, with modern highways and dual-use airports, those natural barriers are shrinking. China wants to ensure that, if conflict ever arises, it can mobilize forces quickly and deny India any advantage that might come from the element of surprise. But deterrence is not only about being ready, it is also about being seen as ready. In geopolitics, perception is as important as reality. When India watches new airbases appear just a short distance from contested zones, it cannot ignore the signal. Even if China insists the projects are defensive, the message is loud and clear. We can act faster than you. That perception alone can shift the balance of power because it forces India to think twice before considering any bold move. Another layer of logic lies in energy security. As China's economy grows and its industries expand, demand for electricity skyrockets. The rise of artificial intelligence and data-driven industries has added even more pressure. Data centers consume massive amounts of power, and China knows that to lead in the digital age, it must secure reliable energy sources. Tibet's rivers provide exactly that, a clean, steady supply of hydroelectricity. In this sense, the Himalayas are not just a border zone, they are a future energy hub. There is also the issue of strategic depth. China's main strategic concern remains on its eastern seaboard, particularly the Taiwan Strait. Any conflict there would draw global attention and possibly outside intervention. But Beijing cannot afford to leave its western flank vulnerable. By strengthening logistics and infrastructure in the Himalayas, China ensures that even if its focus shifts eastward, India will not find an easy opportunity to press its claims in places like Aksai Chin or to pressure China's ally, Pakistan. In other words, the Himalayan buildup is insurance against opportunism. Of course, none of this is happening in a vacuum. India views these moves through its own lens. What China calls stability often looks like encroachment from New Delhi's perspective. And here lies the paradox. The very steps China takes to avoid conflict may be the ones that make conflict more likely. The more air bases China builds, the more India feels compelled to strengthen its own defenses. The cycle of suspicion deepens. So when we talk about logic and motivation, we see both calculation and contradiction. On one hand, China is preparing to deter India and protect its energy future. On the other, its very preparations risk escalating tensions. This is the delicate dance of the Himalayas, building strength to prevent war, but risking that strength being seen as provocation. If China's buildup in the Himalayas looks impressive, India is certainly not standing still. New Delhi has long recognized the challenges of defending its northern frontier, and in recent years it has invested heavily in its own infrastructure and military readiness. But the contrast between the two countries reveals both India's determination and its limitations. On the positive side, India has a strong track record of high-altitude warfare experience. For decades, Indian soldiers have trained and operated in places like Siachen Glacier, one of the highest and harshest military posts in the world. These troops are accustomed to thin air, freezing temperatures, and the unique logistics of mountain warfare. That gives India a level of human experience and resilience that cannot be built overnight. India also operates more than a dozen air bases across its northern hinterlands. Bases in Ladakh, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Arunachal Pradesh form a defensive arc that can respond quickly to activity across the line of actual control. In addition, India has invested in new roads to connect forward posts and improve supply chains. These steps show that India is acutely aware of the risks and is working to counter them. Yet, despite these efforts, the imbalance is hard to ignore. China's infrastructure projects are bigger, faster, and better funded. The pace of construction in Tibet far outstrips what India has managed on its side. Building in the Himalayas is not easy for anyone, but India faces additional challenges: political debates, environmental concerns, and limited budgets. Projects often take years to complete, giving China a head start in terms of mobility and reach. The gap is even more striking when it comes to air power. China is mass-producing advanced fighter jets, including fifth-generation models, while India is still largely reliant on fourth-generation aircraft and has struggled to bring its indigenous fighter programs fully online. This technological difference could play a decisive role if tensions ever escalated beyond small border skirmishes. Add to that China's larger defense budget and greater number of active personnel, and the imbalance becomes even clearer. From New Delhi's perspective, this situation is troubling. Every new Chinese airport or highway near the border looks less like development and more like encirclement. The risk here is psychological as much as physical. If India perceives that it is falling behind, it may feel pressure to act more aggressively to strengthen alliances, to speed up its own projects, or to push back diplomatically. And history shows that when mistrust runs deep, even small incidents along the border can spiral into serious standoffs. At the same time, India is aware that it cannot match China project for project. Instead, it may seek to balance the equation in other ways, by leveraging technology, building partnerships with countries like the United States, Japan, and Australia, and investing in surveillance and rapid response, rather than simply trying to match concrete with concrete. These strategies are less visible than a giant dam or a new runway, but they could still shift the balance in subtle ways. In short, India is far from defenseless. It has trained soldiers, strategic air bases, and growing alliances, but the structural imbalance, the sheer scale of China's buildup, creates risks. The danger is that each side, interpreting the other's moves as threatening, feels compelled to escalate. And in a fragile mountain region, escalation is always a gamble. Up to this point, much of our discussion has been about maps, runways, and strategies. But to truly understand the stakes, we need to zoom in on the lives of the people who live along these borders and rivers, because for them, the consequences of big geopolitical moves are not abstract, they are personal. Take the farmers of Arunachal Pradesh in northeastern India. For generations, their fields have depended on the rhythm of the Brahmaputra River. When the monsoon rains come, the water spreads life across the valleys, nourishing rice paddies and tea plantations. But in recent years, local communities have noticed strange patterns, floods arriving earlier, or water levels dropping too low during crucial planting seasons. While scientists debate how much of this is due to climate change versus upstream dams, for the farmers themselves, the result is the same uncertainty. Crops wither, incomes shrink, and families are left vulnerable. What looks like a technical project upstream feels like a gamble, with their livelihoods downstream. Now picture a group of Indian soldiers stationed in Ladakh, at an outpost nearly 15,000 feet above sea level. Decades ago, their supply lines were painfully slow. Reaching them required convoys winding across treacherous paths, often cut off by snow or landslides. Today, thanks to new roads, trucks can arrive more quickly, but there is a catch. Chinese patrols can also reach the same areas faster from their side. This means the two forces bump into each other more often, sometimes with tense standoffs, sometimes with physical scuffles. For the soldiers on the ground, every patrol feels like walking a tightrope between routine duty and the risk of escalation. Farther south, in Bangladesh, villagers living along the floodplains of the Brahmaputra have their own stories. In years when water is suddenly released upstream, floods sweep through their homes with devastating force. Families scramble to save livestock, children wade through waist-deep water, and local economies take months to recover. In dry years, when water seems to be held back, fishermen complain that their catches decline, and farmers say their fields turn to dust. They do not follow the technical details of dam projects in Tibet, but they feel their effects in every meal, every harvest, every storm. Even within China, in remote Tibetan towns near new airports or highways, daily life is changing rapidly. Villagers who once lived in isolation now see military convoys rumbling past, construction crews blasting tunnels, and government workers surveying land for new projects. Some welcome the new roads that connect them to markets and hospitals. Others worry about cultural erosion, environmental damage, and the heavy presence of security forces. To them, modernization is a double-edged sword bringing opportunity, but also uncertainty. These stories remind us that what governments call strategic infrastructure is not just steel and concrete. It touches farmers deciding whether to plant, soldiers standing guard in thin air, families watching rivers rise or fall, and entire communities adapting to sudden change. The geopolitical chessboard may be the stage, but ordinary people are the ones who feel every move. And that brings us to a crucial point. The real risks of escalation are not only about missiles and jets. They are also about mistrust, miscommunication, and the human cost of decisions made far from the mountains and rivers themselves. When you bring together roads that shorten travel time, airports that can double as military hubs, and dams that influence the lifeblood of entire nations, you do not just create infrastructure, you create uncertainty. And uncertainty is fertile ground for escalation. The Himalayas today represent a paradox. Each side claims to be preparing for stability, but those preparations can just as easily set the stage for crisis. One scenario is what we might call gradual escalation. In this version of the future, China continues its construction spree, new runways, fresh highways, bigger dams, while India responds in kind. Neither side intends to start a war, but the competition itself creates friction. Patrols meet more frequently, airspace becomes more contested, and both governments feel political pressure to stand firm. Even without deliberate aggression, the sheer density of military presence could make accidents more likely. A misinterpreted maneuver, a border skirmish, or even a routine patrol gone wrong could spiral into a dangerous standoff. Another possibility lies in water diplomacy, or water leverage. If China completes its megadams and begins regulating flow on the Brahmaputra, it gains influence over downstream nations whether it wants it or not. In times of political tension, even routine changes in water levels could be perceived as signals or pressure tactics. Imagine a season when India faces drought and water release from Tibet is delayed. Even if Beijing insists it is due to technical issues, the perception in New Delhi and Dhaka could be that it is political. That perception alone is destabilizing, fueling mistrust between neighbors. Then there is the scenario of multi-front distraction. If China becomes deeply engaged in a crisis in the East, say, in the Taiwan Strait, it would need to concentrate resources there. India might then see an opportunity in the West. It could step up pressure in Aksai Chin, or strengthen ties with Pakistan's disputed Gilgit-Baltistan region, which forms part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. A move like that might not trigger all-out war, but it would force Beijing to split its focus, exactly what it hopes to avoid. This dynamic, where each side looks for the other's moment of weakness, is what makes preparation in the Himalayas so critical. There is also the risk of environmental crisis as escalation trigger. Building dams in fragile, earthquake-prone mountains is inherently risky. A landslide blocking a river, a glacial lake outburst flood, or a poorly timed release could devastate communities downstream. In such a moment, accusations could fly. Was it negligence? Was it intentional? Was it a warning? Even if nature is the true culprit, politics could turn disaster into confrontation. Finally, we can't rule out the spiral of mistrust itself. As long as each side interprets the other's projects through a lens of suspicion, even a defensive bunker can look like an offensive base. The irony is that both Beijing and New Delhi may genuinely want to prevent war, but by constantly preparing for it, they may make it harder to avoid. In short, the Himalayas today are more than mountains. They are a chessboard where every road and river is a piece in play. And while the goal may be deterrence, the risks of miscalculation are real. The line between stability and crisis has never been thinner. When we step back from the maps and statistics, it is tempting to see the Himalayas only as a militarized zone or a strategic chessboard. But in my view, this buildup also reveals something deeper about how nations think about power in the 21st century. Roads and dams are no longer just about development. They are about shaping perceptions, managing resources, and projecting influence without firing a shot. One key insight is the trade-off between speed and sustainability. China's rapid construction has given it a visible edge. Roads that took decades to build elsewhere appear in a fraction of the time in Tibet. But speed comes with costs. Infrastructure in high-altitude, earthquake-prone regions faces constant wear, harsh winters, Landslides and shifting glaciers mean maintenance is relentless. If upkeep falls behind, these projects risk becoming fragile symbols rather than lasting strengths. India, on the other hand, has moved more slowly, but its projects, though fewer, often rely on community use and long-term integration. This difference highlights a classic strategic choice, sprinting ahead versus pacing for endurance. Another point is the power of perception. For Beijing, new airports or hydropower stations are framed as defensive insurance and economic progress. For New Delhi, they look like encroachment. Both views can be true at once, and that is precisely the danger. In geopolitics, intent matters less than interpretation. A highway on one side of the border is seen as security, but across the line, it feels like pressure. This is the paradox of deterrence. The very act of showing strength can generate the mistrust that makes conflict more likely. There is also the diplomatic dimension. Infrastructure does not only reshape landscapes, it reshapes relationships. For downstream countries like Bangladesh and Myanmar, China's dam projects raise questions of dependency. Will their rivers flow predictably? Will their economies be at the mercy of decisions made hundreds of miles upstream? These are not small concerns, and they open space for India to step in as a partner, emphasizing cooperation and trust. In this way, water politics may become just as influential as military positioning. Technology adds another layer. China's drive for hydropower is linked to powering AI data centers and an energy-hungry tech economy. India may not be able to match China's infrastructure scale, but it can leverage digital tools, satellites for surveillance, drones for patrols, and AI for predicting water flows or monitoring border activity. Sometimes, innovation can balance raw numbers. Instead of trying to outbuild China, India could out-adapt it. Finally, we cannot ignore the environmental cost. Building megadams in fragile ecosystems risks landslides, flooding, and irreversible ecological change. In the long run, these consequences could undercut the very strategic goals China seeks. If local resentment grows, or if disasters undermine trust, infrastructure that was meant to project strength could instead expose vulnerability. In my view, the lesson here is that real stability requires more than concrete and steel. It requires transparency, communication, and regional trust. Without those, even the most impressive dam or highway may become less a symbol of progress and more a spark for suspicion. The Himalayas remind us that power is not just about who builds the most. It is about who manages the consequences wisely. As we bring together all the threads of this story, the roads, the runways, the dams, and the strategies, a clearer picture begins to emerge. The Himalayas are no longer just a natural barrier between two great nations. They have become a stage where infrastructure is power, where rivers are leverage, and where perception is often as important as reality. And from this, several lessons stand out. The first lesson is that infrastructure is never neutral. A road can bring goods to villages, but it can also carry armored convoys. A dam can provide electricity for millions, but it can also alter the fate of crops downstream. Every project in this region has two faces, one civilian, one strategic. For China, building fast is a way of showing readiness. For India, watching those same projects sparks suspicion. The reality is that both interpretations exist at the same time. That duality is what makes the situation so volatile. The second lesson is that perception shapes policy as much as capability does. Beijing may insist its new bases are defensive, but if New Delhi perceives them as offensive, the effect is the same. Mistrust deepens. Likewise, India's efforts to strengthen its side of the border may be meant as reassurance, but China may see them as a challenge. This cycle of mutual suspicion is dangerous, precisely because it does not depend on intentions. It depends on interpretations. And interpretations can shift with a single incident. The third lesson is about water as a strategic resource. In the 21st century, energy and rivers will matter as much as land and weapons once did. China's ability to control headwaters gives it leverage, but it also creates responsibility. Downstream nations like India and Bangladesh cannot afford to ignore how dams are managed. Cooperation could turn rivers into shared lifelines, but mistrust could turn them into fault lines. Watching how Beijing handles its hydropower projects will be one of the key indicators of where this rivalry is heading. The fourth lesson is about India's path forward. While it may not match China project for project, India has options. By leaning on alliances, investing in technology, and drawing on its long experience in high-altitude operations, New Delhi can offset some disadvantages. But India must also balance caution with assertiveness. Overreaction risks escalation, but underreaction risks vulnerability. Striking that balance will be one of its greatest challenges. Finally, the most important takeaway is that stability requires more than preparation. It requires communication. Without transparency, even a defensive bunker can look like an offensive base. Without trust, even a dam built for power generation can look like a weapon. The Himalayas show us how fragile peace can be when suspicion outweighs dialogue. So what should we watch in the years ahead? Keep an eye on new airport expansions close to disputed borders, the pace of rail connections into Tibet, announcements about megadams on the Yarlung-Tsangpo, and India's responses, whether through alliances, diplomacy, or new military deployments. Each of these developments will shape the next chapter in this unfolding story. The lesson, then, is simple but profound. In the mountains where the world's highest peaks stand, even the smallest projects can cast long shadows. And whether those shadows bring shelter or storm depends not just on steel and concrete, but on the choices leaders make and the trust, or lack of it, that binds nations together. As we reach the end of this journey through the Himalayas, let us take a step back and reflect on what we have uncovered. We began with towering mountains and remote valleys, places that seem timeless and untouchable. Yet, in just a few decades, they have been transformed into one of the most strategically charged landscapes on Earth. Roads now snake through passes that once took weeks to cross. Airports at dizzying altitudes stand ready to host not just travelers, but fighter jets and drones. Rivers that sustained millions for centuries are being reshaped by colossal dams. The lesson here is not only about China or India. It is about how nations use infrastructure as a language of power. Every runway whispers of readiness. Every dam hums, with both promise and threat. Every road is a line drawn not only across mountains, but also across perceptions. To one side, these projects represent development and progress. To the other, they appear as encirclement and preparation. And this duality is what makes the region both fascinating and dangerous. For India, the challenge is clear: how to safeguard its sovereignty without being dragged into an endless race of construction. Matching China step for step is nearly impossible, given the difference in resources. But balancing that disadvantage with alliances, technology, and diplomacy is not only possible, it may be India's best path forward. For China, the challenge is different: how to pursue modernization and secure its borders, without turning every project into a spark for mistrust. In the long run, strength without transparency can weaken stability rather than strengthen it. For the people who live in these mountains and river valleys, the stakes are even more immediate. Farmers in Assam waiting for the river to rise, soldiers in Ladakh patrolling icy ridges, families in Tibet watching new highways carve into their hillsides. They all feel the ripples of decisions made in distant capitals. Their stories remind us that geopolitics is not just about maps and strategies. It is about human lives lived on the front lines of change. And for the rest of the world, the Himalayas hold a lesson that goes beyond South Asia. In an age where competition is global and resources are finite, infrastructure has become a new form of strategy. Control of rivers, access to energy, speed of movement, these will shape not only regional rivalries but also global stability. The Himalayas are a warning and a mirror. They show us how quickly development can turn into tension, and how easily mistrust can turn preparation into provocation. So as we leave the peaks behind, the final takeaway is this: peace is not guaranteed by the size of a dam or the length of a runway. It is secured by trust, communication, and restraint. Without those, even the most impressive projects can cast shadows of fear. With them, the same projects could bring stability and progress to millions. Thank you for staying with me on this exploration. If you found this video thought-provoking, I would love to hear your perspective in the comments. What do you think? Are these projects a sign of defense or a step toward confrontation? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you would like more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and take care.